From the caves and jungles of Hindustan, the classic narrative by Madame Blavatsky, The Banns of Marriage. Next day, early in the morning, the local shikaris went under the leadership of the warlike Akali to hunt glamoured and real tigers in the caves. It took them longer than we expected. The old Beel, who represented to us the absent Dani, proposed that in the meanwhile we should witness a Brahmanical wedding ceremony. Needless to say, we jumped at this. The ceremonies of betrothal and marriage have not changed in India during the last 2 millenniums at least. They are performed according to the directions of Manu, and the old theme has no new variations. India's religious rites have crystallized long ago. Whoever has seen a Hindu wedding in 1879 saw it as it was celebrated in ancient Aryavata many centuries ago. A few days before we left Bombay, we read in a small local newspaper 2 announcements of marriages. The first, the marriage of a Brahmin heiress, the second of a daughter of the fire worshippers. The first announcement was something to the following effect. The family of Bimbe Mavlankar, etc., etc., are preparing for a happy event. This respectable member of our community, unlike the rest of the less fortunate Brahmins of his caste, has found a husband for his granddaughter in a rich Gujarat family of the same caste. The little Ramabai is already 5, her future husband is 7. The wedding is to take place in 2 months and promises to be brilliant. The second announcement referred to an accomplished fact. It appeared in a Parsi paper, which strongly insists on the necessity of giving up disgusting superannuated customs, and especially the early marriage. It justly ridiculed a certain Gujarati newspaper, which had just described in very pompous expressions a recent wedding ceremony in Pune. The bridegroom, who had just entered his 6th year, pressed to his heart a blushing bride of 2.5. The usual answers of this couple entering into matrimony proved so indistinct that the mobed had to address the questions to their parents. Are you willing to have him for your lawful husband, O daughter of Zarathustra? And, are you willing to be her husband, O son of Zoroaster? Everything went as well as it could be expected, continued the newspaper. The bridegroom was led out of the room by the hand, and the bride, who was carried away in arms, greeted the guests not with smiles, but with a tremendous howl, which made her forget the existence of such a thing as a pocket handkerchief, and remember only her feeding bottle. For the latter article she asked repeatedly, half choked with sobs, and throttled with the weight of the family diamonds. Taking it all in all, it was a Parsi marriage, which shows the progress of our speedily developing nation with the exactitude of a weather-glass, added the satirical newspaper. Having read this, we laughed heartily, though we did not give full credit to this description, and thought it a good deal exaggerated. We knew Parsi and Brahmin families in which were husbands of 10 years of age, but had never heard as yet of a bride who was a baby in arms. It is not without reason that the Brahmins are fervent upholders of the ancient law which prohibits to everyone, except the officiating Brahmins, the study of Sanskrit and the reading of the Vedas. The Shudras and even the high-born Vaishyas were in olden times to be executed for such an offence. The secret of this rigour lies in the fact that the Vedas do not permit matrimony for women under 15 to 20 years of age, and for men under 25 or even 30. Eager above all that every religious ceremony should fill their pockets, the Brahmins never stopped at disfiguring their ancient sacred literature, and not to be caught, they pronounced its study accursed. Amongst other criminal inventions, to use the expression of Swami Dayanand, there is a text in the Brahmanical books, which contradicts everything that is to be found in the Vedas on this particular matter. I speak of the Kudva Kunbis, the wedding season of all the agricultural classes of Central Asia. This season is to be celebrated once in every 12 years, but it appears to be a field from which Messieurs les Brahmins gathered the most abundant harvest. At this epoch, all the mothers have to seek audiences from the goddess Mata, the Great Mother, of course through her rightful oracles, the Brahmins. Mata is the special patroness of all the 4 kinds of marriages practiced in India. the marriages of adults, of children, of babies, and of specimens of humanity that are as yet to be born. The latter is the queerest of all, because the feelings it excites are so very like gambling. In this case, the marriage ceremony is celebrated between the mothers of the future children. Many a curious incident is the result of these matrimonial parodies, but a true Brahman will never allow the derision of fate to shake his dignity, and the docile population never will doubt the infallibility of these elect of the gods. An open antagonism to the Brahmanical institutions is more than rare. The feelings of reverence and dread the masses show to the Brahmins are so blind and so sincere that an outsider cannot help smiling at them and respecting them at the same time. If both the mothers have children of the same sex, it will not upset the Brahmin in the least. He will say this was the will of the goddess Mata. It shows that she desires the newborn babies to be two loving brothers or two loving sisters, as the case may be, in future. And if the children grow up, they will be acknowledged heirs to the properties of both mothers. In this case, the Brahmin breaks the bonds of the marriage by the order of the goddess, is paid for doing so, and the whole affair is dropped altogether. But if the children are of different sexes, these bonds cannot be broken, even if they are born cripples or idiots. While I am dealing with the family life of India, I had better mention some other features, not to return to them any more. No Hindu has the right to remain single. The only exceptions are, in case the child is destined to monastic life from the first days of his existence, and in case the child is consecrated to the service of one of the gods of the Trimurti even before he is born. Religion insists on matrimony for the sake of having a son, whose duty it will be to perform every prescribed rite in order that his departed father may enter Swarga, or paradise. Even the caste of brahmacharyas, who take vows of chastity but take a part and interest in worldly life, and so are the unique lay celibates of India, are bound to adopt sons. The rest of the Hindus must remain in matrimony till the age of 40, after which they earn the right to leave the world and to seek salvation, leading an ascetic life in some jungle. If a member of some Hindu family happens to be afflicted from birth with some organic defect, this will not be an impediment to his marrying, on the condition that his wife should be also a cripple, if she belongs to the same caste. The defects of husband and wife must be different. If he is blind, she must be humpbacked or lame, and vice versa. But if the young man in question is prejudiced and wants a healthy wife, he must condescend to make a mésalliance. He must stoop to choose a wife in a caste that is exactly 1 degree lower than his own. But in this case, his kinsmen and associates will not acknowledge her. The parvenu will not be received on any conditions whatever. Besides, all these exceptional instances depend entirely on the family guru, on the priest who is inspired by the gods. All the above holds good as far as the men are concerned, but with the women it is quite different. Only the Nauches, dancing girls consecrated to gods and living in temples, can be said to be free and happy. Their occupation is hereditary, but they are Vestals and daughters of Vestals, however strange this may sound to a European ear. But the notions of the Hindus, especially on questions of morality, are quite independent, and even anti-Western, if I may use this expression. No one is more severe and exacting in the questions of feminine honour and chastity, but the Brahmins prove to be more cunning than even the Roman augurs. Rhea Silvia, for instance, the mother of Romulus and Remus, was buried alive by the ancient Romans, in spite of the god Mars taking an active part in her faux pas. Numa and Tiberius took exceedingly good care that the good morals of their priestesses should not become merely nominal. But the Vestals on the banks of the Ganges and the Indus understand the question differently from those on the banks of the Tiber. The intimacy of the Nautch girls with the gods, which is generally accepted, cleanses them from every sin, and makes them in everyone's eyes irreproachable and infallible. A Nautcher cannot sin, in spite of the crowd of the celestial musicians who swarm in every pagoda in the form of baby Vestals and their little brothers. No virtuous Roman matron was ever so respected as the pretty little Nautcher. This great reverence for the happy brides of the gods is especially striking in the purely native towns of central India, where the population has preserved intact their blind faith in the Brahmins. Every Naucha can read and receives the highest Hindu education. They all read and write in Sanskrit and study the best literature of ancient India and her 6 chief philosophies, but especially music, singing and dancing. Besides these god-born priestesses of the pagodas, there are also public Nauchas who, like the Egyptian Almayas, are within the reach of ordinary mortals, not only of gods. They also are in most cases women of a certain culture. But the fate of an honest woman of Hindustan is quite different, and a bitter and incredibly unjust fate it is. The life of a thoroughly good woman, especially if she happens to possess warm faith and unshaken piety, is simply a long chain of fatal misfortunes. And the higher her family and social position, the more wretched is her life. Married women are so afraid of resembling the professional dancing girls that they cannot be persuaded to learn anything the latter are taught. If a Brahmin woman is rich, her life is spent in demoralizing idleness. If she is poor, so much the worse, her earthly existence is concentrated in monotonous performances of mechanical rites. There is no past and no future for her, only a tedious present from which there is no possible escape. And this only if everything be well, if her family be not visited by sad losses. Needless to say that, amongst Brahmin women, marriage is not a question of free choice, and still less of affection. Her choice of a husband is restricted by the caste to which her father and mother happen to belong, and so, to find a suitable match for a girl is a matter of great difficulty, as well as of great expense. In India, the high caste woman is not bought, but she has to buy the right to get married. Accordingly, the birth of a girl is not a joy, but a sorrow, especially if her parents are not rich. She must be married not later than when she is 7 or 8. A little girl of 10 is an old maid in India. She is a discredit to her parents, and is the miserable butt of all her more fortunate contemporaries. One of the few noble achievements of Englishmen in India which have succeeded is the decrease of infanticide, which some time ago was a daily practice, and still is not quite got rid of. Little girls were killed by their parents everywhere in India, but this dreadful custom was especially common amongst the tribes of Jadej, once so powerful in Sindh, and now reduced to petty brigandage. Probably these tribes were the first to spread this heartless practice. Obligatory marriage for little girls is a comparatively recent invention, and it alone is responsible for the parents' decision rather to see them dead than unmarried. The ancient Aryans knew nothing of it. Even the ancient Brahmanical literature shows that, amongst the pure Aryans, woman enjoyed the same privileges as man. Her voice was listened to by the statesman. She was free either to choose a husband or to remain single. Many a woman's name plays an important part in the chronicles of the ancient Aryan land. Many women have come down to posterity as eminent poets, astronomers, philosophers, and even sages and lawyers. But with the invasion of the Persians, in the 7th century, and later on of the fanatical, all-destroying Mussulmans, all this changed. Woman became enslaved, and the Brahmins did everything to humiliate her. In towns, the position of the Hindu woman is still worse than amongst agricultural classes. The wedding ceremonies are very complicated and numerous. They are divided into 3 groups: the rites before the wedding, the rites during the ceremony, and the rites after the celebration has taken place. The first group consists of 11 ceremonies: the asking in marriage, the comparison of the 2 horoscopes, the sacrifice of a goat, the fixing of a propitious day, the building of the altar, the purchase of the sacred pots for household use, the invitation of guests, the sacrifices to the household gods, mutual presents, and so on. All this must be accomplished as a religious duty and is full of entangled rites. As soon as a little girl in some Hindu family is 4 years old, her father and mother send for the family guru, give him her horoscope, drawn up previously by the astrologer of their caste, a very important post, and send the guru to this or that inhabitant of the place, who is known to have a son of appropriate age. The father of the little boy has to put the horoscope on the altar before the family gods and to answer, "I am well disposed towards the panigrana. Let Rudra help us." The guru must ask when the union is to take place, after which he is bowed out. A few days later, the father of the little boy takes the horoscope of his son, as well as of the little girl, to the chief astrologer. If the latter finds them propitious to the intended marriage, it will take place. If not, his decision is immediately sent to the father of the little girl, and the whole affair is dropped. If the astrologer's opinion is favourable, however, the bargain is concluded on the spot. The astrologer offers a cocoa nut and a handful of sugar to the father, after which nothing can be altered. Otherwise, a Hindu vendetta will be handed down from generation to generation. After the obligatory goat sacrifice, the couple are irrevocably betrothed, and the astrologer fixes the day of the wedding. The sacrifice of the goat is very interesting, so I am going to describe it in detail. A child of the male sex is sent to invite several married ladies, old women of 20 or 25, to witness the worship of the Lares and Penates. Each family has a household goddess of its own, which is not impossible, since the Hindu gods number 33 crores. On the eve of the sacrificial day, a kid is brought into the house, and all the family sleep round him. Next morning, the reception hall in the lower story is made ready for the ceremony. The floor is thickly covered with cow dung, and right in the middle of the room a square is traced with white chalk, in which is placed a high pedestal with the statue of the goddess. The patriarch of the family brings the goat, and holding him by the horns, lowers his head to salute the goddess. After this, the old and young women sing marriage hymns, tie the legs of the goat, cover his head with red powder, and make a lamp smoke under his nose to banish the evil spirits from round him. When all this is done, the female element puts itself out of the way, and the patriarch comes again upon the stage. He treacherously puts a ration of rice before the goat, and as soon as the victim becomes innocently absorbed in gratifying his appetite, the old man chops his head off with a single stroke of his sword and bathes the goddess in the smoking blood coming from the head of the animal, which he holds in his right arm, over the idol. The women sing in chorus, and the ceremony of betrothal is over. The ceremonies with the astrologers and the exchange of presents are too long to be described. I shall mention only that in all these ceremonies the astrologer plays the double part of an augur and a family lawyer. After a general invocation to the elephant-headed god Ganesha, the marriage contract is written on the reverse of the horoscopes and sealed, and a general blessing is pronounced over the assembly. Needless to say that all these ceremonies had been accomplished long ago in the family to whose marriage party we were invited in Bagh. All these rites are sacred, and most probably we, being mere strangers, would not have been allowed to witness them. We saw them all later on in Benares, thanks to the intercession of our Babu. When we arrived on the spot, where the Bagh ceremony was celebrated, the festivity was at its height. The bridegroom was not more than 14 years old, while the bride was only 10. Her small nose was adorned with a huge golden ring with some very brilliant stone, which dragged her nostril down. Her face looked comically piteous, and sometimes she cast furtive glances at us. The bridegroom, a stout, healthy-looking boy, attired in cloth of gold and wearing the many-storied Indra hat, was on horseback, surrounded by a whole crowd of male relations. The altar, especially erected for this occasion, presented a queer sight. Its regulation height is 3 times the length of the bride's arm, from the shoulder down to the middle finger. Its materials are bricks and whitewashed clay. 46 earthen pots painted with red, yellow and green stripes, the colours of the Trimurti, rose in 2 pyramids on both sides of the god of marriages on the altar, and all round it a crowd of little married girls were busy grinding ginger. When it was reduced to powder, the whole crowd rushed on the bridegroom, dragged him from his horse, and having undressed him, began rubbing him with wet ginger. As soon as the sun dried him, he was dressed again by some of the little ladies, whilst one part of them sang and the other sprinkled his head with water from lotus leaves twisted into tubes. We understood that this was a delicate attention to the water gods. We were also told that the whole of the previous night had been given up to the worship of various spirits. The last rites, begun weeks ago, were hurriedly brought to an end during this last night. Invocations to Ganesha, to the god of marriages, to the gods of the elements, water, fire, air and earth, to the goddess of the smallpox and other illnesses, to the spirits of ancestors and planetary spirits, to the evil spirits, good spirits, family spirits, and so on, and so on. Suddenly our ears were struck by strains of music. Good heavens, what a dreadful symphony it was. The ear-splitting sounds of Indian tom-toms, Tibetan drunis, Sinhalese pipes, Chinese trumpets, and Burmese gongs deafened us on all sides, awakening in our souls hatred for humanity and humanity's inventions. De tous les bruits du monde, celui de la musique est le plus désagréable, was my ever-recurring thought. Happily, this agony did not last long, and was replaced by the choral singing of Brahmins and Nautches, which was very original, but perfectly bearable. The wedding was a rich one, and so the Vestals appeared in state. A moment of silence, of restrained whispering, and one of them, a tall, handsome girl with eyes literally filling half her forehead, began approaching one guest after the other in perfect silence, and rubbing their faces with her hand, leaving traces of sandal and saffron powders. She glided towards us also, noiselessly moving over the dusty road with her bare feet, and before we realized what she was doing, she had daubed me as well as the Colonel and Miss X, which made the latter sneeze and wipe her face for at least 10 minutes, with loud but vain utterances of indignation. The Babu and Mulji offered their faces to the little hand, full of saffron, with smiles of condescending generosity. But the indomitable Narayan shrank from the Vestal so unexpectedly at the precise moment when, with fiery glances at him, she stood on tiptoe to reach his face, that she quite lost countenance and sent a full dose of powder over his shoulder, whilst he turned away from her with knitted brow. Her forehead also showed several threatening lines, but in a moment she overcame her anger and glided towards Ram Runjit Das, sparkling with engaging smiles. But here she met with still less luck. Offended at once in his monotheism and his chastity, the god's warrior pushed the Vestal so unceremoniously that she nearly upset the elaborate pot decoration of the altar. A dissatisfied murmur ran through the crowd, and we were preparing to be condemned to shameful banishment for the sins of the warlike Sikh, when the drums sounded again and the procession moved on. In front of everyone drove the trumpeters and the drummers in a car gilded from top to bottom, and dragged by bullocks loaded with garlands of flowers. Next after them walked a whole detachment of pipers, and then a third body of musicians on horseback, who frantically hammered huge gongs. After them proceeded the cortege of the bridegrooms and the bride's relations on horses, adorned with rich harness, feathers and flowers. They went in pairs. They were followed by a regiment of Bills in full disarmour, because no weapons but bows and arrows had been left to them by the English government. All these Bills looked as if they had toothache, because of the odd way they have of arranging the ends of their white pagris. After them walked clerical Brahmins, with aromatic tapers in their hands and surrounded by the flitting battalion of Nautches, who amused themselves all the way by graceful glissades and pas. They were followed by the lay Brahmins, the twice-born. The bridegroom rode on a handsome horse. On both sides walked 2 couples of warriors, armed with yaks' tails to wave the flies away. They were accompanied by 2 more men on each side with silver fans. The bridegroom's group was wound up by a naked Brahmin, perched on a donkey and holding over the head of the boy a huge red silk umbrella. After him, a car loaded with 1,000 cocoa nuts and 100 bamboo baskets, tied together by a red rope. The god who looks after marriages drove in melancholy isolation on the vast back of an elephant, whose mahout led him by a chain of flowers. Our humble party modestly advanced just behind the elephant's tail. The performance of rites on the way seemed endless. We had to stop before every tree, every pagoda, every sacred tank and bush, and at last, before a sacred cow. When we came back to the house of the bride, it was 4 in the afternoon, and we had started a little after 6 in the morning. We all were utterly exhausted, and Miss X literally threatened to fall asleep on her feet. The indignant Sikh had left us long ago, and had persuaded Mr. Y and Mulji, whom the colonel had nicknamed the Mute General, to keep him company. Our respected president was bathed in his own perspiration, and even Narayan the unchangeable yawned and sought consolation in a fan. But the Babu was simply astonishing. After a 9 hours' walk under the sun, with his head unprotected, he looked fresher than ever, without a drop of sweat on his dark, satin-like forehead. He showed his white teeth in an eternal smile, and chaffed us all, reciting the Diamond Wedding of Stedman. We struggled against our fatigue in our desire to witness the last ceremony, after which the woman is forever cut off from the external world. It was just going to begin, and we kept our eyes and ears wide open. The bridegroom and the bride were placed before the altar. The officiating Brahman tied their hands with some couscous grass and led them 3 times round the altar. Then their hands were untied, and the Brahman mumbled a mantram. When he had finished, the boy husband lifted his diminutive bride and carried her 3 times round the altar in his arms. Then again 3 turns round the altar, but the boy preceding the girl, and she following him like an obedient slave. When this was over, the bridegroom was placed on a high chair by the entrance door, and the bride brought a basin of water, took off his shoes, and having washed his feet, wiped them with her long hair. We learned that this was a very ancient custom. On the right side of the bridegroom sat his mother. The bride knelt before her also, and having performed the same operation over her feet, she retired to the house. Then her mother came out of the crowd and repeated the same ceremony, but without using her hair as a towel. The young couple were married. The drums and the tom-toms rolled once more, and half-deaf we started for home. In the tent we found the Akali in the middle of a sermon, delivered for the edification of the Mute General and Mr. Y. He was explaining to them the advantages of the Sikh religion and comparing it with the faith of the devil worshippers, as he called the Brahmins. It was too late to go to the caves, and besides, we had had enough sights for one day. So we sat down to rest, and to listen to the words of wisdom falling from the lips of the god's warrior. In my humble opinion, he was right in more than one thing. In his most imaginative moments, Satan himself could not have invented anything more unjust and more refinedly cruel than what was invented by these twice-born egotists in their relation to the weaker sex. An unconditioned civil death awaits her in case of widowhood, even if this sad fate befalls her when she is 2 or 3 years old. It is of no importance for the Brahmins if the marriage never actually took place. The goat sacrifice, at which the personal presence of the little girl is not even required, she being represented by the wretched victim, is considered binding for her. As for the man, not only is he permitted to have several lawful wives at a time, but he is even required by the law to marry again if his wife dies. Not to be unjust, I must mention that, with the exception of some vicious and depraved Rajas, we never heard of a Hindu availing himself of this privilege and having more than one wife. At the present time, the whole of Orthodox India is shaken by the struggle in favour of the remarriage of widows. This agitation was begun in Bombay by a few reformers and opponents of Brahmins. It is already 10 years since Mulji Tekar Singh and others raised this question, but we know only of 3 or 4 men who have dared as yet to marry widows. This struggle is carried on in silence and secrecy, but nevertheless it is fierce and obstinate. In the meanwhile, the fate of the widow is what the Brahmins wish it to be. As soon as the corpse of her husband is burned, the widow must shave her head and never let it grow again as long as she lives. Her bangles, necklaces and rings are broken to pieces and burned, together with her hair and her husband's remains. During the rest of her life she must wear nothing but white if she was less than 25 at her husband's death, and red if she was older. Temples, religious ceremonies, society are closed to her forever. She has no right to speak to any of her relations, and no right to eat with them. She sleeps, eats, and works separately. Her touch is considered impure for 7 years. If a man going out on business meets a widow, he goes home again, abandoning every pursuit, because to see a widow is accounted an evil omen. In the past, all this was seldom practiced, and concerned only the rich widows who refused to be burned. But now, since the Brahmins have been caught in the false interpretation of the Vedas, with the criminal intention of appropriating the widow's wealth, they insist on the fulfillment of this cruel precept, and make what once was the exception the rule. They are powerless against British law, and so they revenge themselves on the innocent and helpless women, whom fate has deprived of their natural protectors. Professor Wilson's demonstration of the means by which the Brahmins distorted the sense of the Vedas in order to justify the practice of widow burning is well worth mentioning. During the many centuries that this terrible practice prevailed, the Brahmins had appealed to a certain Vedic text for their justification and had claimed to be rigidly fulfilling the institutes of Manu, which contained for them the interpretation of Vedic law. When the East India Company's government first turned its attention to the suppression of suttee, the whole country, from Cape Comorin to the Himalayas, rose in protest under the influence of the Brahmins. The English promised not to interfere in our religious affairs, and they must keep their word, was the general outcry. Never was India so near revolution as in those days. The English saw the danger and gave up the task. But Professor Wilson, the best Sanskritist of the time, did not consider the battle lost. He applied himself to the study of the most ancient MSS, and gradually became convinced that the alleged precept did not exist in the Vedas, though in the laws of Manu it was quite distinct and had been translated accordingly by T. Colebrook and other Orientalists. An attempt to prove to the fanatic population that Manu's interpretation was wrong would have been equivalent to an attempt to reduce water to powder. So Wilson set himself to study Manu and to compare the text of the Vedas with the text of this lawgiver. This was the result of his labours. The Rig Veda orders the Brahman to place the widow side by side with the corpse, and then, after the performance of certain rites, to lead her down from the funeral pyre and to sing the following verse from Graya Sutra. Arise, O woman, return to the world of the living. Having gone to sleep by the dead, awake again. Long enough thou hast been a faithful wife to the one who made thee mother of his children. Then those present at the burning were to rub their eyes with collyrium, and the Brahman to address to them the following verse. Approach, you married women, not widows, with your husbands bring ghee and butter. Let the mothers go up to the womb first, dressed in festive garments and costly adornments. The line before the last was misinterpreted by the Brahmins in the most skillful way. In Sanskrit it reads as follows, Arohantu janayo yonim agre. Yonina agre literally means to the womb first. Having changed only one letter of the last word agri, first, in Sanskrit script, the Brahmins wrote instead agne, fires, in Sanskrit script, and so acquired the right to send the wretched widows, Yonina Agne, to the womb of fire. It is difficult to find on the face of the world another such fiendish deception. The Vedas never permitted the burning of the widows, and there is a place in Taittiriya Aranyaka of the Yajur Veda where the brother of the deceased or his disciple or even a trusted friend is recommended to say to the widow, whilst the pyre is set on fire, Arise, O woman, do not lie down any more beside the lifeless corpse, return to the world of the living, and become the wife of the one who holds you by the hand and is willing to be your husband. This verse shows that during the Vedic period, the remarriage of widows was allowed. Besides, in several places in the ancient books, pointed out to us by Swami Dayanand, we found orders to the widows to keep the ashes of the husband for several months after his death, and to perform over them certain final rituals. However, in spite of the scandal created by Professor Wilson's discovery, and of the fact that the Brahmins were put to shame before the double authority of the Vedas and of Manu, the custom of centuries proved so strong that some pious Hindu women still burn themselves whenever they can. Not more than 2 years ago, the 4 widows of young Bahadur, the chief minister of Nepal, insisted upon being burned. Nepal is not under the British rule, and so the Anglo-Indian government had no right to interfere.